About 180 miles east of here is a famous granite rock formation that towers 5,000 feet above the forested valley below. On clear days, its curved face stands stark against the expansive eastern California skyline. Do you know this stony icon? Have you too marveled at its jagged angles and impossible beauty? I first encountered Half Dome on my first trip through Yosemite National Park at the age of 22, driving north from Los Angeles on my way home to Portland, Oregon. I only stopped over in Yosemite for a day or so, but the stopover on the long drive was an important respite, a moment of pause between where I had been and where I was going. As I rested briefly there under the shadow of Half Dome and the shade of those marvelous giant sequoias, I remember being moved by the perspective of the landscape. In particular, I was drawn to those giant towering trees standing in awe beneath their branches, marveling at their beauty. I learned on that trip that these trees can grow hundreds of feet tall, and perhaps even more amazing than their size, can live for thousands of years. One of the oldest trees in Yosemite is known as the grizzly giant in Mariposa Grove. Scientists estimate that old grizzly is about 1,800 years old, give or take a century or two. And they also say that this is not actually very old in the lifespan of a sequoia. Some have been known to live for 3,000 years. 3,000 years? Can you imagine? Can you even try to imagine what it would be like to live that long? To bear witness to so much transition? Those giant trees have seen major long-term changes in the environment, watched geologic formations emerge, seen entire species of animals come and go, weathered changes in temperature over centuries and millennia. In more recent history, those giant sequoias have also witnessed the devastation wreaked by European American colonists in the region, as the native Miwok peoples have been slowly and systematically killed and pushed off the land that is their home. These trees carry in them this multitude and complexity of painful and tangled history. With the perspective of their years, they understand perhaps better than anyone else the profoundly contradictory nature of life, that it can be at once so breathtakingly beautiful and also shot through with violence and death. These tall, towering fortresses carry so much within them, and their magnificence is one of the many miracles of living in this particular corner of the world. Now, I don't know if you all have noticed, but we live in a ridiculously beautiful place. Now, I've had the privilege of living in many different parts of the country, and while they're all beautiful, I know that no place is beautiful quite like this area. Never in my life can I remember so frequently finding myself overwhelmed by the landscape that I am forced to stop in my tracks and appreciate its presence. In fact, when I first moved here last summer, this stark beauty proved to be somewhat of an inconvenience, as I found myself constantly pulling my car over to marvel at my surroundings. This practice, while joyful and nourishing, was admittedly a bit inconvenient and really slowed down my commute to work. Do you also find yourself bowled over by the natural beauty of this place? Do you sometimes find yourself stopping the car or reaching for your phone in an attempt, often in vain in my case, to take a picture and capture the sheer magnitude of it all? I ask in part because I suspect that I'm not alone in my wonder, and also because I know it is so easy to forget. Amid the hustle and bustle and the grind of daily life, we can forget and become immune to being shocked by the world around us. But it's important to remember. In fact, I hazard to suggest this morning, whether you've lived here only 8 months, as I have, or your entire life, that it's important to stop occasionally, pull over the car, observe, wonder, marvel. I find myself thinking a lot about the landscape of this place as we celebrate Earth Day today. On a day that was originally created to draw attention to the earth and the need to care for it and protect against human-caused environmental degradation, there is so much running through my mind. I feel this incredible gratitude for this place, for the mountains, for the wildflowers, and even, occasionally, when I'm feeling generous, for the gaggles of wild turkeys that run around this campus, which never fail to make me laugh. I embrace this gratitude and celebrate it, offering prayers of thanks for the small and large miracles that surround us. And on this Earth Day, in addition to this deep gratitude, I also feel a deep concern and outrage for the ways in which human beings have threatened the future of this planet with fossil fuels and climate change. Concern and outrage over the fact that these environmental concerns disproportionately impact the lives of people of color and people living in poverty, who are forced to deal with the consequences of selfish decisions made by corporations and politicians more interested in profit and re-election than the future of this planet. Concern and outrage that in spite of all we now know about climate change, ice caps continue to melt and sea levels continue to rise, and animals, including thousands of people, are displaced from their homes and habitats. Concern and outrage that in the midst of all of our hubris and greed, we human beings seem to have forgotten that we are not outside the world or above or beyond it, but rather an integral part of it. There are days, plenty of days, in fact, when the overwhelm and concern for this one singular and hurting planet feels like too much. Days when I'm not entirely sure what to do with my outrage and my grief over all that has been lost. The difficult and honest truth is that there is still so much work to do to reverse the impact of climate change. The difficult and honest truth is that it is already too late to save many beings and landscapes that have suffered the most extreme human-made environmental degradation. The difficult and honest truth is that we must act for justice anyway, in the face of this pain, uncertainty, and grief. On the days when I feel this grief most acutely, I recall the words of environmentalist and author Wendell Berry, the words that our choir so beautifully sang for us a few moments ago. Berry wrote, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with the forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free." Berry is saying to us here that our cure for despair about the environment is in fact returning to it and marveling at all the beauty that still remains in the midst of all the brokenness, allowing that beauty to nourish our spirits and renew our courage and our resilience. When despair for the world grows in me these days, when I feel overwhelmed by the hurt of our planet, I find myself wandering through the redwood grove here on our very own church campus. While these trees are somewhat different than the giant sequoias I first encountered in Yosemite, something about their sheer magnitude instills in me that same sense of perspective and awe. I know the trees do not necessarily have the answers for my grief, but somehow in wandering among them, I feel less alone in my questions. It wasn't until after I had been working here at Mount Diablo for a little while that I learned the story of this beautiful redwood grove at the front of our campus, which I learned is a sacred memorial, one which honors the life of Benjamin Chapel, a 16-year-old member of this congregation who died in a tragic train accident on a youth group field trip in 1975. As Marge Chapel, Ben's mother, will still tell you, Ben's ashes fertilized the soil in that grove, giving new life to the trees that grow there. When I wander through the grove and I think about Ben's life, I think about all the wisdom that those redwood trees carry in them. I think about the truth that lives in their gnarled bark. All that those trees might have to teach us about what it means to be human in this wild and beautiful world, about grief, about healing, about the perspective of time, the importance of resilience, and the possibility of transformation. There is so much that can be learned in the thick of the woods. On this Earth Day, I wonder if maybe we need to make a little more room in our movement for environmental justice for grief. I wonder if sometimes we are so quick to turn to action that we forget to allow ourselves to experience the depth of loss at what has occurred in the world around us. I know people in ministry and in the environmental movement who have begun to speak of a need for planetary hospice. Leaders who acknowledge that while we must take action to promote environmental justice, we also must mourn what we have loved and what we have lost. This grieving is not meant to promote defeatism nor self-indulgence or apathy, but mourning can be honest and real and deeply humanizing. I think again of Wendell Berry and the line in his poem when he writes, "Wild things do not tax their lives with the forethought of grief." I don't quite agree with Berry here. While I appreciate his words suggesting we return to the beauty of earth for solace, I'm not certain that there's any corner of existence that remains untouched by grief. As our seventh principle asserts, we Unitarian Universalists believe in the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And that means that as a human being, I do not know myself to be outside of the world, but deeply woven into its fabric. I know myself to be a wild thing, one who is often deeply taxed by the weight of grief Berry writes about. None of us can escape it entirely, no matter how many wood drakes or herons we encounter. While experiencing this depth of grief can be uncomfortable, psychologist Catherine Schaefer reminds us that it's also essential to being alive. Schaefer writes, "Grief escorts up an even deeper feeling, a truth about your life, what you value and what you need. Perhaps how much you wanted something, how deeply you care about someone." As Schaefer points out, there is an important ever-present corollary to grief, and that corollary is care. That corollary is love. In this sense, grief serves as a reminder not only of what we have lost, but of what we have dared to love, We need our sacred memorial redwood groves to remind us not only of the depth of our grief, but also of the depth of the love we have experienced. As the wise old redwoods know, there is no love separate from loss, no beauty apart from brokenness. These parts of life remain deeply entangled like complex root systems stretching into the ground. It is not enough to rest in this grieving forever. The utility of grief, like most emotions, has its clear limits. And I want to say that it is still important for us to take action even in the midst of our grief and uncertainty. And yet, it seems that grief is an important, if oft forgotten and ignored, part of the process of building the beloved community. By taking time to honor grief and to acknowledge the love that lies at its center, we can then return to the work of justice making, perhaps even more resilient. And what we need now more than ever is resilience. As UU ministers and environmentalists Peggy Clark and Matthew McHale write in their essay for the new book, Justice on Earth, we are facing an almost incomprehensible emergency. Building resilient communities is the transformative process that these times demand. Paradoxical as it might seem, honoring our collective grief over the destruction of the earth also leads us to the love that will sustain us as a community, a love that will grant us resilience to keep moving forward. And so today, I want to invite us to think about how we can make a little more room for the memorial redwood groves in our lives. How can we together as a community make space to wander through the forest of our collective grief so that we might emerge on the other side more courageous and even more ready to do the work of healing the planet? I do not have all the answers for us today, but I am ready to explore the questions together. And ultimately, in the midst of all that remains unknown, the truest thing I do know is that we still need each other. We need the support of this community. We need one another as we cry and laugh and wonder at the impossible beauty and absurdity of it all. We need one another as we hold our grief and love and hope. We need one another for resilience and possibility and courage as we hike deeper and deeper into this old growth forest, winding down a mysterious trail. May we on this day remember to draw strength from our interconnection to all that is on this earth, holding close the beautiful, if maddening, truth that we do not journey alone. May it be so. Amen.